to the Scaling Japan podcast, a podcast about how to grow your business from $100,000 and beyond in the land of the rising sun.
Welcome to the Scaling Japan podcast. I am your host, Tyson Batino, and I would like to thank Reachx for sponsoring this episode. Reachx is a fast-growing recruitment firm in Japan that also runs eJabo, a job board for English-speaking or bilingual tech jobs in Japan and Japanese-speaking jobs in other countries. They have linked to some very useful blog posts they have on Japanese business culture and recruitment in the show notes. So please check them out. And on today's episode, we have Evan Burkosky. He is an angel investor, startup advisor, and the head of enterprise digital marketing at TechnoPro, a publicly traded company on the Tokyo Stock Exchange. Prior to this, he worked as a sales director or country manager for well-known global software companies like Optimizely, FullStory, Parsley, and Dynamic Yield. I personally was a user of FullStory. He has extensive experience in selling to corporations and government, and will share some sales frameworks to guide our business to get more sales and to target the right customers. So Evan, could you tell us a little bit more about yourself?
It's a pleasure to be back. This is our second episode. In the introduction there, I should qualify that I wasn't always working directly for some of those companies. I was sometimes a solutions partner, so working on the agency side. So I was building local teams in Japan to help support those technologies and bring them to market. In addition to that, I've started several of my own startups. And it was always very important to both market and sell those products, whether I was developing a new product myself or bringing a new product to the Japanese market, had to create the local sales and marketing. So in connection with the previous episode where we talked more about marketing funnels, I wanted to talk about the bottom of funnel and the sales strategies. I think it's important to sort of frame things right off the bat. Again, your audience is probably mostly entrepreneurs who are looking to scale up their business. And so they're probably struggling with a lot of these issues. And what I thought we could do is talk through some of the common sales, methodologies and deal qualification frameworks. And I'm just going to sort of condense it all down into what I've personally found works for the Japanese market. So this is like my take on what works, and it's trying to condense it all down and make it as concise as possible. So hopefully it'll be simple and applicable.
I think this topic will be very useful to the audience. And our audience, I would say, is a mixture of small business owners, a mixture of B2B and B2C, but we also do have country managers and startup founders who listen to the podcast. And the other thing I think talking about sales methodologies and qualification frameworks would be useful because there's a lot of good information on sales on the internet, but there's not a lot of great information on like what is the best framework for Japan that goes into ultra detail. So I think for a lot of people, they might have heard about some of the frameworks we'll talk today, but I think it'll be useful in that you share how you applied it to Japan. Please tell us, what is a sales methodology?
Basically, a sales methodology is like a guide through the sales process. So you know what the steps are and you have some idea of what to expect. It just removes some of the chaos out of the sales process. You can think of it as like a roadmap to where a successful deal is likely to start and end, and then how to repeat that process. Some of the common sales methodologies are things like the challenger sale, which I personally like, or spin selling, meat selling. There's lots of different frameworks. The goal is to create predictable revenue. So this book that I recommend here called From Impossible to Inevitable, this is an especially good book. It talks about sales methodologies for creating hyper-growth companies. And SaaS is a commonly referenced model there. Software as a service can scale very quickly, grow very quickly. So this is a model often used for that. But the goal is to create this predictable and scalable revenue. And you can't predict how your sales are going to grow. And if you're working with a startup, it's very difficult to know what your future likely revenue is going to be if you can't see whether your sales are going well or not. So essentially, in a nutshell, sales methodology is that guide to predict whether your sales are on track or not.
And I like how a lot of sales methodologies, they kind of have like a step-by-step process. And I also like how in a lot of cases, like they have sample questions for each step as well. So just breaking it down and helping people not see sales as just you visit the client, they're gonna purchase in the first meeting, you get the sell and it's all over. No, and it's like really just break it down into all the steps that goes into really getting a sale. It's not like you're selling an English lesson where it's like, it might be like $100, but you're selling something that's thousands of dollars or even tens of thousands or millions of dollars.
Right. And whether you're running this for your own business as an individual startup founder, or you're starting as part of a sales team, you might be a starting sales development representative or account executive, or you're trying to manage a team as a sales director or kind of coach your team. This gives a framework so that even a total beginner can start with the process and then follow those steps, and that gives them the framework for success.
I haven't heard really too many of the methodologies mentioning when your interaction with the customer starts in the customer journey. Like, is it their first time they hear about you because maybe you cold called them, maybe they found you through marketing, and how it differs between B2B, B2C, and like how things have changed. Like in the past, it was really like starting from scratch, but nowadays people do a lot more research. But could you tell us, at least in the B2C case, and we'll move on to B2B after it, when does your interaction really start with a customer in their customer journey to becoming a customer?
So if you think of the marketing and sales journey as a funnel, very top of funnel awareness. So the potential customer is becoming aware of the product and services that you sell. And that's either through their own research or through your outbound or proactive contacting of them and starting a conversation with them. But as they go through this journey from initial awareness down to actually becoming a customer, they basically are going through an education process, asking themselves a lot of questions, or they're discussing with their team what's required out of the solution, how to best implement it, what their actual needs are. Even if it's for an individual purchase, I'm going through the process of thinking, do I need this service? How am I going to use it? Can I justify the cost, and so on? So you have to educate yourself. And basically, you can think of the line between marketing and sales as being when that real one-to-one conversation starts. So in the case of B2C, if I'm a consumer, say I want to purchase a new device like an iPhone or something like that, I'm going to do a lot of research. I'll probably go to review sites and check out what other people say about this device, and then check all the features and really educate myself on what I think I need. And then I'll choose the device that I think is right for me. I'll probably go to a website, or it might be in person to the store, but I'll basically sign up. All I really need a salesperson for in that journey then is the final step to assist me with the final purchasing. If it's physically in the store, sign up for the contract and so on, or basically just give them my money. But if it's an online purchase, maybe sign up initially for a trial or like a proof of concept, and see what questions might remain until I become a long-term customer. So the only thing I really need the salesperson's help with is that final last step in the transaction process. Well, that's the B2C funnel essentially, right? So the point at which the conversation with the salesperson starts is very much at the bottom of the funnel. Now, if we go into B2B, your conversation is likely starting much, much sooner, basically near the top of the funnel. So your customer probably has some awareness of a problem that needs a solution. They've probably talked about it internally. Maybe they've procured approximately the budget necessary for it. They've done some initial research, and maybe they're showing some buying signals. They're starting to visit your website or maybe attend your seminars or something like that. It seems like they're in a buying mood, let's say. So you can reach out to them and start the conversation at that point. But there's still a lot of steps in that funnel that you have to go through together through constant conversation with them and their team members before you get to the final purchase point. You're starting the conversation near the top of the funnel, and then you're taking them through all those steps together. The sales methodology gives you a guide for where you are on that journey and what steps are likely to come up next, what the most likely hurdles are coming forward.
Yeah, I think that's the perfect way to describe the difference. And it matches my experience with creating a really successful English school. And yeah, I think for the B2B side, sometimes it's kind of like watching a hero's journey movie. You
Yeah.
have all these obstacles, all these hurdles that pop up suddenly. Eventually, a deal happens. Maybe choosing the right adventure
Mhm.
would be a good way to segue from that theme. But first off, what is a deal qualification framework?
A deal qualification framework is a framework that sits inside of your larger sales methodology. So the sales methodology being everything from first step in that journey through to closing the deal. A deal qualification framework just tells you where you are right now on that journey and what the next steps are likely to be so that you can predict where you are. So if you're an individual entrepreneur, you want to know how much longer is it likely to take, what's left on this hero's journey, what mountains we have to climb before we can actually get to a deal. And then if you're an individual member of a sales team, a deal qualification framework allows you to tell your sales director, this is where I think the deal is right now. I think it's on track. I think we need X number of days or weeks or months to close the deal. These are the steps that we have to overcome, and then we can complete it. And I predict that it will close and we can book the revenue on this date. Now, of course, that's really important in a SaaS business model because you need that scalable, predictable revenue. Being able to predict what your revenue is likely to be allows you to make necessary investments in order to grow the business. And it also connects with getting fundings, whether that be debt or equity funding. Your investors will feel confident because you can dashboard out essentially what your revenue is likely to be.
I mean, having a map is not perfect, but it's a pretty good representation of the location that you're going to. I guess with the deal qualification framework, you can sometimes use it as kind of not like a map, but like you could talk to someone who knows about desert terrain and like things you need to know about desert terrain and use that as a reference when you go there, as opposed to going to the desert and trying to figure it out from scratch.
Right. And the really important thing is that having a framework like this gives you that map so that you can both get through the desert yourself, but also guide your customer. I think a lot of people make the mistake that they expect that their customer will know how to purchase your product or service. And that's often not the case. In fact, once you've been through the desert a few times, you now become a guide who knows how to lead your customers through that process. Most sales have traditionally, let's say for the past 15 years or so, been based on a relationship based sales methodology. So it's a shift from the old pressure based sales where buy now, this is absolutely what you need, just trust me, just buy it, to really educating the customer and building a relationship and answering all their questions. The problem with a relationship based sale is that if you don't have a good sales methodology and a deal qualification framework, you get blindsided by hurdles that you didn't see coming. And it's really disappointing. When you're first starting a business and you're building these relationships, you're investing all of this time and you're spending so much effort to answer all the questions that your potential customer might have. And then something comes up, some other team member on their side says, I need this feature. And if we don't have that, we can't purchase it. Or maybe the procurement department says, oh, you haven't gone through these steps, so we won't be able to put it into this year's budget. You can get blindsided in a lot of ways. And if you've based your whole sales methodology on just building a personal relationship, that can be really crushing when it doesn't work out. And I think this is one reason why a lot of people in sales and business in general get quite frustrated because you've invested so much of yourself in making this work. But if you know what the likely hurdles are, you're not going to be blindsided by it. You're going to know that most likely when we get to this stage in the deal, it might seem like we're on track, but we still have to remove some of these hurdles over here. And if you've done that a few times, then you can guide your customer or your prospect rather through that process and move the deal forward by proactively thinking ahead. It gives you control over the future of the deal so that you can guide both yourself and your prospect through that desert.
That'll be very useful. It reminded me of companies like Kintone, one of the famous Japanese SaaS companies. They actually have a slide deck that you can download, which is for the purpose of simply how to navigate internally.
Exactly. And that's not common knowledge. A lot of Japanese companies, maybe even if your prospect is a manager, they may not know what the procurement steps are for your particular product or service.
In their case, I think they just pray and spray, but they put all these use cases and say, like, please choose from here.
every
Yeah.
contingency. No, it sounds like a good guide. I guess that touches on why sales methodology is important, but also why it's important for the Japanese market.
I wanted to give another big thank you to our supporters Rechex and eJabble. If you have not visited the eJabble site, there's a ton of great content on job hunting and also how to succeed working in a Japanese company. Not getting enough Japanese work culture content to fulfill your appetite through our podcast? Check out their website for more good content. See the link in the show notes below. Also, please give a shout out and thank you to Himanshu Jain and the team for supporting this podcast.
Maybe we could talk a little bit about what's unique in the Japanese market.
Yes, please lead the way.
Okay, so just to recap a little bit, when we talk about a sales methodology, there are a lot of them out there. And some of the ones that I've heard of are, again, like the SPIN sales methodology, NEAT, N-E-A-T selling, SNAP selling, Sandler system. There's all sorts of different methodologies out there. What I personally like, and I've found works the best, is the Challenger sale methodology. And Challenger Sale was a book that was put out. The authors were Matthew Dixon and Brent Adamson. They started with data, which I always like. I like having a logical methodology. And their data indicated that the old relationship-based method of sales wasn't actually that effective. What was a repeatable, reproducible model was more what they called the Challenger model, where sales reps were asking a lot of questions up front, and they were kind of anticipating what hurdles might be and then helping their customer work through that. So that was a revolutionary book, and it started the Challenger methodology. But its sequel is even better. It's called the Challenger Customer. And Challenger Customer works through the data about how people actually buy. Now, the important thing to note there is that deals are getting more and more complex all the time. Complexity is coming from, in the case of software being more and more usable by more and more people all the time. So in the past, you might have had maybe a data tool, analytics, or something like that you would purchase for the marketing team, and that would give them more insight into the customer journey. But these days, it's very likely that that tool would be used by marketing and sales and PR and maybe by purchasing and procurement and all sorts of different departments. Even an individual business, it's quite likely that you're going to be purchasing something, a service, maybe it's a consulting service. You're going to want to get buy-in and sort of a check off from your co-founder and maybe your investors and all of your staff. So really the key there is stakeholder alignment. I find a lot of these sales methodologies, they're a little bit ethnocentric to the Western market, especially like the relationship-based sales model. This was trying to find the person in the corner office who could become your champion and push the deal through. I would say those days are gone because not only is the purchasing process getting more complex, but there are more and more stakeholders involved. And there's rarely a single decision maker anymore who can pull the trigger on a deal. So it's changing in the Western market as things are getting more complex. Sales methodology like Challenger and the deal qualification framework like MEDDIC is becoming more and more important. But it's always been the case in Japan. There's always been the culture of sharing responsibility for all decision making across as many stakeholders as possible. And so you want to go and proactively find who all the stakeholders are and what all of their objections are likely to be, answer all of their questions up front, and get stakeholder consensus and complete team alignment so that the Lingisho process, or the literal sign-off process, this is usually an internal document that's circulated within a company, so that process goes very smoothly. So I've found that Challenger, because it proactively tries to seek out all of the skeptical questions you're likely to encounter early on, that's the most successful framework because it gets alignment early on in the process. So especially as outlined in the Challenger Customer, what you want to do is find your skeptics and answer all of their questions in as much detail as possible so that they then kind of turn around and become your champions and help you move through the rest of the process. If you can find somebody who's kind of infamous in the target company as being a skeptic and asking difficult questions, if you can answer all of their questions and get them on your side, it's very likely that the deal will go much more smoothly after that. I'll just add one last thing. What I find in the Japanese market is that because of that group consensus type model, relationship-based sales is traditionally extremely important. Most salespeople do focus on building a personal relationship, and then having a good sales methodology and deal qualification framework removes some of the disappointment that they're likely to experience if the deal doesn't go through, and helps them to kind of reduce the personal capital that they're investing in each deal.
In a lot of my experience talking with salespeople who haven't really been on the other side, like, the implementation side, or are not too aware of it, I find that they often really underestimate the amount of cost in time and energy and opportunity costs it takes to implement a software solution that impacts even 30 people, 50 people, and I couldn't imagine like 500 people. Like, just the risk of error, like, wastes so much time.
Yeah, it can be really frustrating when you feel like, what usually happens. So let's walk through a typical scenario. You've identified a good prospect. Maybe they came to your website and they downloaded some information, maybe a white paper, or you maybe met somebody at a conference and you had a really good conversation, exchanged business cards. They seem really keen. And so you spend a few weeks following up with them, working them through all of the sort of due diligence that they have to do. And it looks like the deal's on track. And they say, okay, I've got sign off from my boss. We're going to be able to sign this next week. And you start essentially counting that revenue, whether it's your own startup and you say, okay, great, I can count this one and start working on the next deal. Or you report that to your sales director and they put it into their forecast and that reports up to the CEO. You start to think, I've got a verbal sign off, everything's on track. Well, what usually happens, and this is like most of the time, your champion who said that they got sign off from their boss doesn't realize that sign off from their boss is just the first step in quite a long process. So their boss still has to then go and circulate a dingy show with other stakeholders. They still have to get sign off from the procurement department, which often has a lot of paperwork. They still have to actually get that budget released. And that process and the amount of paperwork and the type of paperwork involved, especially in the Japanese market, it's often something that mid-level managers or individual employees who are purchasing something, they have no experience with. But if you have a deal qualification framework for this type of customer, you should identify them as being a fit with your ICP or ideal customer profile, like we talked about in the last session. But if this person is a fit, then you know what that organization steps are likely going to be. Of course, every company will have some specifics, but for the most part, when your champion says, okay, I've got sign off from my boss, I think I'm going to be able to sign next week, you can then ask them a few questions like, okay, great. So after your boss signs off, what is the next step? And what do they have to do then to release the budget? And when is that likely to be released? And when can we actually get started? Now, a lot of the time they don't know. And so you have to proactively use your experience and say, all right, well, it sounds like we're on track, but in my experience, the next step is usually this, and then it usually takes about this long. So I think we're probably not next week. Sounds like we're probably about a month and a half away still. That's much more realistic. Once you can start arming your champion to proactively think through the next steps, that gives them a little bit more control over what they need to expect. And it helps you kind of guide them through that desert. And, as an experienced salesperson or business person, you've been through that desert many times and you know where the pitfalls are and what to expect, but your customer usually doesn't know. So framework helps you guide them through that.
What are some of the common deal qualification frameworks?
The overall sales methodology aside, once you feel like you're on track, you've got a deal that's coming, say your prospect says that they've got sign off from their boss, that's just one of the steps in a good deal qualification process. And there are a lot of different frameworks out there. The most common one in Japan is called BANT, B-A-N-T. I find that most Japanese sales teams are familiar with this process. It's been around for, I think, about 25 years or something now. It was originally developed at IBM. So BANT stands for Budget, Authority, Needs, and Timeline. I.e., does your prospect actually have the budget necessary to purchase your product or service? Have they got sign off? Do they have the authority? Does it solve a real problem? Is there a real need for it? And then how long is it going to take to implement it? What is the timeline? So that's BANT. Now, BANT is a good process if you have a really simple product. But most of the time, product to service, it's not that simple. And again, there are more and more stakeholders involved in purchasing decisions all the time. Plus, just by default in Japan, with the need for that Dingisho process, it's always going to be more complex. So I'm a real fan of the MEDIC framework. There are different variations on this. There's MEDIC, MEDDICC is kind of the most common framework, but there's variations with a P in there, MEDPIC. What it stands for is essentially metrics. So metrics maps more or less to budget, what's necessary to solve the problem and then prove that the problem is being solved. What are the KPIs or KGIs? ME, so E stands for economic buyer, who's the person who's actually making the purchasing decision. I usually think of this as buyers because in the Japanese market, it's never just one person. D stands for decision criteria. And then the second D stands for decision process. So is there a Lingisho required? Or does this person have individual purchasing authority? Sometimes happens if it's within a smaller amount. There are certain tiers of different companies. If you include P for MEDPIC, P would be paper process. That's usually rolled into the decision process because paper just means, is there a Lingisho, for example? And you can combine that with a decision process as one of the steps you have to go through. I stands for implicate the pain. So you always want to make sure that there's actually a real problem that you're providing a solution for, and that's clear to everybody. The first C is for champions, who are the people who are going to help you move forward. I would say that as per the challenger customer, again, your champion is probably going to be the biggest skeptic at your prospect's company. And if you can answer all their questions and overcome their initial skepticism, they will then turn around and be your best friend. They'll be your champion. The second C is for competition. So who else is in the deal? Sometimes you get through all the different hurdles and you think that you're going to get a signature, but some other competitor comes along and kind of undercuts you or maybe has a little bit better offer. So you can sometimes lose the deal right at the last stage there. And then MEDPIC, sometimes there's an R added for risk. I usually simplify the process and just go with MEDIC because I think that covers everything. So again, to recap, MEDIC is metrics, economic buyer, decision maker, decision process, implicate the pain, champion, and competition. And so if you've thought through all of those and you've mapped out where you're likely to face those different issues and made sure that you've identified the pain and you've identified what the KPIs or KGIs are, it's quite likely that you'll have a framework for getting through the deal well. And one thing to keep in mind is that MEDIC, whatever version of the acronym you use, it's not actually a sequence. It's just organizing those in an easy to remember format. So you don't actually go through MEDDD. You have to go through and identify all of these things in a natural, sort of organic way as the conversation moves forward with your prospect.
I'm not sure if it was on purpose, but yes, like you have a potential customer and maybe you need triage, so you need a medic to.
Yeah, that's a great way to remember it. And a lot of people use that part of their sales training as well. We're a doctor trying to solve our customer's pain. Where does that pain lie? How can we identify it? So yeah, that's a good way to remember it.
I think in terms of competitor as well, one point I want to add is competitor could also be internal. It could be another department competing for the same budget. Because at least in my case, when I was running work optimizations, an idea would come in as a director or leadership team member, I would think it's really useful for this department, but as a company as a whole, is it actually the best solution? And that would be a question I'll often ask internally.
You could hire or develop or put together the necessary resources to build something in-house. And so that's part of the process you have to go through. You have to identify, should your prospect actually be solving this problem in-house, or is there a real strong need for you to help them with your solutions?
Could you elaborate a little bit more on why is MEDIC potentially more effective than BANT, even though it's well known and popular in Japan for modern SaaS?
I'll simplify and say that the BANT framework doesn't really map to Japan's use of Lingisho and complete stakeholder alignment, because You could maybe argue that in BANT, budget, authority, needs, and timeline, the authority is mapping out who the stakeholders are, but it's quite an oversimplification. So with the MEDIC framework, you're really looking at what are the metrics, what are the KPIs, what is the actual pain, what problem are you actually solving, what is the decision process, what is the decision criteria, who are the decision makers, who are all of the stakeholders. So it's a more detailed framework for making sure that you've got complete team alignment across all potential stakeholders, across all potential different divisions, to make sure that there's no hidden pitfalls. And once you've mapped out exactly what's important across all these different stakeholders and there's full alignment, then you can clear that all essential Lingisho process.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Scaling Japan. In addition to serving as your fine host, I also provide advisory and coaching services to business owners who want to 2x, 5x, and even 10x their business. So stop holding your company and your team and your employees back, and let me help you and your company scale. Find more information at scalingyourcompany.com. Now back to the episode.
So a Lingisho is a stakeholder alignment document. In Japan, it's an official process. Everybody who's identified as a stakeholder within an organization at a certain level has to be identified. So this might be a hiring decision, it might be a purchase order, it might just be a decision about when to have the next meeting, internal team meeting or something like that. But any time somebody in a Japanese organization feels that they have to make a decision and they want to make sure that this is going to be a safe decision which won't be easily undone, and they don't want to accept too much personal responsibility for it, which is important. In Japanese corporate culture, you have to protect your career by not undertaking individual decisions. You have to make sure that everybody's on board with the decision. So you basically map out a proposal, you put it in a document. Traditionally, you print that out as paper, and then you take it around to every single stakeholder and get them to sign off by stamping their income on that document. For a while, I worked within the Japanese government. When I was doing that, I would often come into work and there would be some Lingisho on my desk, and sometimes a bit of a stack of them. And I would have to sort through each one, understand what it was about, and then talk with all the other stakeholders until I felt I was on board and I felt safe in making the decision, and I could accept the responsibility, the shared responsibility with the rest of the team. And if I decided yes, then I would stamp off on it. If I didn't decide yes, it would require more conversations. And those would be official conversations held in the office. Sometimes they would be done over dinners or nomikais. One reason why nomikais were traditionally so important in Japan was to get this type of stakeholder alignment, or more formal meetings or more requests for documentation would be held. And once everybody is aligned, every stakeholder who's been identified has signed off on that, then it can move forward. It's really important to know this process to do business in Japan, because sometimes it's a real mystery why things don't move forward. And the reason is because this all essential Lingisho process, it won't move forward if there are any dissenters. If somebody is identified as a stakeholder, and whether it's not about their position, it doesn't matter if they're a director or a manager or if they hold a title or not. If they're identified as being affected by this decision, then they'll be included in that Lingisho. Sometimes that's a courtesy, sometimes it's corporate policy, internal policy. But if somebody doesn't sign this, then it doesn't move forward. And it's also interesting to note that this Lingisho process is driving digitization, digital transformation in Japan, because during the pandemic, when people were asked not to go into the office, Lingishos would pile up on their desk because they couldn't physically go in to stamp them. And so business came to a halt, essentially. So some people were taking the trains, going into the office just so they could stamp off on all of these Lingisho, pick it up and put it over on the next person's desk. Anyway, it's a very important part of doing business in Japan. And whether it's formalized as a Lingisho or not, stakeholder alignment is always essential to doing business in Japan. So you have to work this into your deal qualification process and your overall sales methodology and anticipate how complex that's going to be. and then probably multiply that by a factor of 3 because it's always way more complex than you think it's going to be.
So I think one question that I am very interested is based on the size of the deal in your experience, how does that actually impact the Ringi show or the Ringi show process? Of course, it differs between companies, and let's say every company has a different organizational structure. But based on the deal size, do you have any insights into that?
Well, let's quantify deal size. Would that be monetary value or would it be the number of stakeholders affected?
I would say probably monetary size might be an easier frame of reference.
The larger the amount of the deal, conversely, the more smoothly the Lingy Show process is likely to go. And that's probably because it's a larger organization that's able to make larger purchases. So at the enterprise level, this journey through the desert, as it were, has been undertaken enough times that your prospect probably knows the process. At a smaller organization, it's quite likely that they don't have as well-defined a process, so it probably takes much longer.
By
It's quite
smaller organization, how many employees?
It depends on the size of the deal, but let's say that it's around 50 to 100 people. It's quite likely that even if the deal size is smaller, say it's a few $1,000s, that's probably going to take longer than it would for a large corporation to make a $250,000 purchase.
Okay, no, that makes sense. We're probably in the bigger, smaller size. We've only had a few big deals, so I think that makes perfect sense that we didn't have a dedicated process in place. It was more just the person who was trying to push it in. They'll make a presentation, people would ask questions, and we'll do maybe a couple back and forths. And after 3 or 4 times, we'll make the final decision. There was no process for it. We had a meeting on it, and please come back with your answers to these questions.
One thing to be aware of, especially with like the SaaS business model, which often relies on scalability and being efficient as possible, because you need to get as many subscribers as possible, as quickly as possible. If you're launching a SaaS business, you have to be careful not to go too small, because the smaller individual customers, small businesses, they tend to be more resource heavy than larger organizations for the size of the deal. So you actually waste more time selling to smaller businesses. They have more questions. They don't have, the process mapped out on their side. They need to speak with their co-founder or their spouse more often. And it's just more difficult because their budgets are often quite tighter. So you want to get to that sweet spot of selling to medium and large size enterprises as quickly as possible with most small SaaS businesses.
Being on the side of the small size, which is the target for, let's say, several $1,000 yearly deals, I can definitely attest to that. There's no paved road for us. We're just trying to pave it as we go and just patch up spots.
Right. There's no precedent, right? You don't know how to go through that process already, and you don't necessarily know if the software is going to be the right fit for you or not. But with larger organizations and people, again, who've been through that desert many times, it gets easier. So yeah, it's good to target those larger organizations. But don't always assume that that's going to be the case, because even a large organization, your type of product or solution may be a first for them. There may not be precedent. And in that case, then it's going to take much longer at the large enterprise level, because you have to map out that process and document it formally. And so it's not only a Lingy Show process, the rule book for writing the Lingy Show has to be created at the same time.
Cool, thanks for highlighting that. And I think another point I want to mention, maybe for the medic or med pick, what type of deal size would really justify implementing such an intensive but very useful deal qualification framework?
Well, in general, whenever you have an outbound sales team, and I would say that the line for being able to afford an outbound sales team is if you have a product or service that sells for at least $3,000 annually. If it's not above 3,000, you just can't afford to pay for a dedicated sales team to sell that. If it's below that line, you probably want to make it as self-service possible so that you focus more on the marketing and customers are able to self-educate. So you're only interacting with them at the very bottom of the funnel when they've already educated themselves as much as possible and they're ready to pull the trigger and make a purchasing decision. But if you're at that sweet spot is say $5,000 US per year and up, So whether it's per project or per individual unit sale, you want to get up to that 5 and above. Of course, if your product is say 100,000 or $250,000 annually, then you can afford the full sales team. So that would be SDR, BDR, AEs, accounts, executives, account managers, success team, support team, sales directors. You can afford the entire infrastructure so that you're reaching out, going outbound and starting that conversation even earlier with anybody who fits your ICP, or ideal customer profile.
And my last question would be, how would you relate Medic towards the channel's partners for sales?
When you're working with channel partners, most of the time, they're probably going to be using a relationship-based sales method because they tend to sell to their existing client portfolio. They're not really looking to go out and develop new relationships and do outbound sales for the most part. Most partners, you've chosen them to be a partner because they have clients already. And so it's helpful to be able to use a deal qualification framework so that you can map out where they are in the sales process. And you need to introduce a framework to your partners so that you can understand where they are on the journey and predict when a deal is likely to close. Partners, even more so than individual sales reps, partners tend to suffer from happy ears. So they'll reach out to a prospect with your solution and the prospect says, okay, yeah, we'll take a look at it. Or yeah, my boss says it looks interesting, let's try it. And the partner tends to report back immediately, okay, yeah, they want to buy. You feel like it's almost locked in. In reality, it's probably going to take a very long time to work through the entire sales process. And in the same way, you need to, like a sales director, mapping out where individual reps are in the sales process, you need to be able to do that with your partners as well. I would say that it's really a good idea to invest in partner training on at least Medic, at least the deal qualification framework. They probably aren't as receptive to the overall sales methodology training as your own in-house team will be. They're not really doing so much outbound sales, so the entire like challenger sales type of methodology may not be appropriate for them, but definitely the Medic deal qualification framework. And with partners, they are also stakeholders in that process. They often need to support product or solution that you're selling. And so they need to be able to sign off essentially on that minutiae or purchasing process as well. So you need to map out where the partner is and the ability to provide support and meet the necessary KPIs.
Excellent. Thank you for that. Yes, like just for the audience, I would definitely recommend checking our first episode with Evan on inbound sales and also episode with Mario Ono on route versus account sales. I don't think we clarified it today, but we're talking a lot about sales methodology, but also deal qualifications for account-based sales.
Right. I would say account-based sales and account-based marketing, or ABM as it's often called. We talked a little bit about ICP, or ideal customer profile. Account-based sales is essentially just mapping out what that ICP is and then proactively going out and finding those customers and then starting your conversation, not necessarily with the individual contacts in your personal network, but more people who work within the target account. You're mapping out how that conversation should go and the various touch points and the overall education process of that target account, which means all of their stakeholders, not just the individual people. So ABS, account-based sales or account-based marketing, is taking that, again, ideal customer profile and mapping that out across everybody who might be involved in that purchasing decision for a target account.
And do you have any messages or requests to the audience?
Well, I think we'll include a list of resources that we talked about. I highly recommend taking a look at those books that we mentioned. Please feel free to reach out to me either via my website or LinkedIn profile if you have any questions. I'm always happy to chat about this sort of thing and to give some more advice. I hope that we took a fairly complex subject and distilled it down into something fairly concise. But yeah, if you have any more questions, please feel free to reach out to me anytime.
Excellent. Thanks for having you on, Evan. I think we'll probably have a round 3 sometime in the future.
That'd be great. Okay, thanks very much for the opportunity to talk, Tyson, and look forward to the next potential session.